Imagine this. A cold silence clings to the royal palace of Madrid. It is the evening of September 29th, 1833. Inside a grand chamber, lit only by flickering candlelight, a man lies motionless in bed. He is pale, bloated, and gasping for air. At just 48 years old, his body is ravaged by syphilis, a cruel punishment for a lifetime of indulgence. That man is Ferdinand VII, King of Spain. Once draped in royal robes and surrounded by reverence, he now fades alone, eaten from the inside out by the consequences of his own depravity. Doctors surround him, helpless and frantic. They attempt to soothe the open ulcers covering his skin, applying salves and whispering prayers. His moans, twisted and guttural, echo through the empty palace halls like a warning. There is no dignity in this death. The man who once thundered about Catholic virtue and Spanish honor is being unmade by the very pleasures he chased so recklessly. The irony is merciless. Ferdinand built his reign on tradition and moral authority, yet his private life was a theatre of corruption. Now he pays the price. But how did it all begin? How did Ferdinand, born into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, fall so far so disgracefully? To understand the moral collapse of this monarch, we must go back to the beginning. The stains on the Spanish crown didn't appear overnight. They were sown in his childhood, fed in secrecy, and bloomed in power. Before we unravel the twisted legacy of Ferdinand VII, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind history's most infamous rulers, consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's amazing to think that across time zones and continents, we're piecing together the shattered mirrors of history, united by curiosity and by a shared obsession with power, corruption, and the men who let empires rot from the inside. Ferdinand was born on October the 14th, 1784, at a time when Spain still saw itself as a titan of Europe. His father was King Charles IV, his mother, Queen Maria Louisa of Parma. But this royal household was no beacon of virtue. The court Ferdinand grew up in was soaked in decadence and vice. Loyalty was rare, scandal was routine, sex, not diplomacy, was the true language of the palace. Queen Maria Louisa was notorious for her affairs. The most infamous of them was with Manuel Godoy, a man of humble birth who climbed to power by seducing the queen and manipulating the king. Through her, he became the shadow ruler of Spain. While ministers debated policy, Godoy decided it all, from war strategies to royal marriages. He didn't just influence the crown, he owned it. And Ferdinand watched. He learned. But what he absorbed was not leadership. It was corruption. From an early age, his behavior unsettled even the most hardened courtiers. By age 10, he had developed an appetite for cruelty. He took pleasure in torturing animals, particularly cats, and delighted in humiliating the servants. There are records of him forcing grown men into degrading acts for his entertainment. His tutors tried to intervene, but any who dared challenge the prince were quickly dismissed or reassigned. He was protected, and that made him dangerous. As he grew older, his education fell apart. Where other European heirs studied philosophy, governance, and foreign languages, Ferdinand rejected it all. He found no value in art or literature, had no grasp of economics, and no curiosity about the wider world. He preferred to linger in shadows, watching, spying, scheming. He had peepholes carved into palace walls so he could secretly observe the intimate moments of others. It wasn't mischief, it was obsession. His only true interest was control. At 18, he was married to his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. The union was meant to stabilize him, to refine his instincts and mature him through duty, but the effect was catastrophic. Behind the palace curtains, Ferdinand subjected his young wife to acts of extreme humiliation. Court documents, kept hidden for decades, detail disturbing patterns of abuse. Maria Antonia, raised in a devout and cultured court, found herself trapped in a nightmare. Her spirit withered. She withdrew from public life. She avoided her husband, isolated herself, and lived as a prisoner in her own home. And still, Ferdinand grew darker. He began using his title as a weapon. With the authority of a king and the immunity of royalty, he targeted the women of his court. He began to coerce them, ladies in waiting, daughters of noblemen, threatening to disgrace their families unless they submitted to his demands. What began as private perversion became institutional terror. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. Wrapped in silence and protected by power, women whispered warnings in hallways. Servants looked away. Ministers said nothing. In the court of Ferdinand VII, fear replaced justice and shame replaced tradition. The Spanish crown, once a symbol of empire and faith, became a mask worn by a man who ruled not through law or wisdom, but through intimidation, blackmail, and cruelty. Ferdinand developed a particular obsession with seducing married women. For him, it wasn't about passion, it was about domination. He saw each conquest as a way to humiliate their husbands and assert his power over them. Many noblemen, desperate to maintain their courtly positions, were forced to look the other way while their wives were exploited. In 1806, when his wife Maria Antonia died suddenly at just 21 years old, whispers began to circulate among the palace physicians. Officially, the cause of death was tuberculosis, but rumors persisted. Some suspected poison, others believed she died of sheer despair, broken by the relentless abuse she had endured. Ferdinand's reaction only fueled the suspicion. He expressed no grief. In fact, he was flippant, even smug, saying that he was now free to pursue more interesting pleasures. 2 years later, in 1808, as Napoleon's armies invaded Spain, the nation stood on the edge of collapse. It was a moment that called for unity, leadership, and courage. But Ferdinand saw something else, a chance to seize power. During the uprising in Aranjuez, which forced his father Charles IV to abdicate, Ferdinand quickly positioned himself as heir. Yet, when the time came to resist the French, he showed nothing but cowardice. Instead of defending his country, he entered secret negotiations with Napoleon, offering Spain itself in return for personal safety and power. The infamous meeting in Bayonne between Ferdinand and Napoleon exposed the true character of the future Spanish king. French observers present at the negotiations described Ferdinand as pathetic, groveling before the emperor, willing to promise anything in exchange for retaining his privileges. Napoleon, who had seen his fair share of spineless monarchs, was still taken aback. He later remarked that he had never met anyone so vile sitting on a throne. While in forced exile at the Chateau de Valençay, Ferdinand lived not in suffering, but in lavish comfort. Entirely at Napoleon's expense, he showed no concern for the fate of his homeland. Instead, he gave himself fully to pleasure. He seduced French servants, hosted orgies with fellow Spanish exiles, and contracted his first venereal disease from a local prostitute. Letters intercepted by French intelligence revealed Ferdinand's regular requests for women and his absolute indifference to the pain of his people. When he returned to Spain in 1814, many hoped for a new beginning. Instead, Ferdinand brought back absolutism and corruption. One of his first acts was the restoration of the Inquisition. Not out of religious fervor, but for personal gain. The tribunals gave him unchecked authority to persecute rivals, extort noble families, and exploit women. He frequently accused women of heresy, then offered forgiveness in exchange for sexual submission. In 1816, he entered a second marriage, this time with Isabella of Braganza, a 19-year-old Portuguese princess. The match had nothing to do with love. She had been essentially sold by her family to secure a political alliance. Ferdinand, now 32 and deeply entrenched in his perversions, treated Isabella with even greater cruelty than his first wife. The court, already corrupt, descended further into moral decay. Under Ferdinand, royal appointments became transactional. Ministers were selected not for their talent, but for the attractiveness of their wives or daughters. the palace turned into a royal brothel. Officially, many women held positions as ladies in waiting, but in truth, they were there to satisfy the king's lust. He maintained an informal harem inside the court, and his sexual practices, even by the permissive standards of the time, were shocking. Secret documents uncovered generations later describe a disturbing picture. Ferdinand was obsessed with domination and humiliation. He forced women into degrading acts in front of witnesses, turning intimacy into a grotesque performance for his own amusement. This spiral of cruelty reached a final tragic chapter in 1818, when Isabella of Braganza died. Another young wife broken by the man who ruled Spain, not with justice or wisdom, but with greed, cruelty, and unchecked desire. Like his first wife, Isabella of Braganza died young and under suspicious circumstances. Court doctors noted evidence of severe physical trauma and deep psychological distress. Her final confessor, breaking silence years later, revealed that Isabella had spoken of wanting to die, believing death to be the only escape from the relentless torment inflicted by her husband. Ferdinand responded to her death with the same cold indifference he had shown before. Within months, he arranged a third marriage, this time to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a timid 20-year-old girl delivered into the hands of a man already infamous for cruelty. The marriage lasted barely 2 years. She, too, died under mysterious conditions, further feeding the belief that Ferdinand was quite literally destroying his wives through physical abuse and psychological degradation. By the 1820s, Ferdinand had reached the absolute peak of his depravity. He kept dozens of mistresses simultaneously, some of them nuns whom he coerced into breaking their vows through threats, blackmail, or sheer desperation. His most disturbing obsession, however, was with virgins. He offered rewards to anyone who brought him young and inexperienced girls, turning his court into a marketplace of flesh. Some families, impoverished and hopeless, chose to sacrifice their daughters for royal favor, seeing dishonor as preferable to starvation. While the palace descended into depravity, Spain itself fell apart. One by one, the American colonies declared independence. The economy disintegrated. Civil unrest swept across the country. The once mighty Spanish Empire was collapsing, but Ferdinand, consumed by his insatiable appetites, remained utterly detached from reality. In 1829, he entered his fourth and final marriage. Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, just 23 years old, became his last wife. The union was not born of love, but desperation. Ferdinand needed an heir. By this time, however, he was already gravely ill. Syphilis, contracted long ago from one of his encounters with prostitutes, had begun to attack his brain. His violence diminished, not from mercy, but because his body and mind were failing. His final years were a slow and degrading collapse. The disease produced open sores, excruciating pain, and severe cognitive decline. Even the best physicians of the court could not conceal the true nature of his condition. Rumors spread rapidly. Courtiers whispered of a king in irreversible decay, whose body reeked of rot and whose mind had sunk into confusion and madness. By the end of September 1833, Ferdinand lay dying, alone, bloated, and abandoned. Most of those who had once feared him were gone. Many of his victims were dead. The few remaining courtiers kept their distance, repelled by the stench from his infected wounds. Even his doctors came only out of duty. Once a tyrant feared by all, he had become a helpless wreck, rotting in the same bed where he had inflicted so much suffering. Death came for him on September 29th. With it ended one of the most disgraceful reigns in European history. Ferdinand VII died as he had lived, corrupt, cruel, and utterly despised. There were no sincere tears at his funeral, only relief. A nation exhaled, free at last from the shadow of its tormentor. His only legitimate child, the future Queen Isabella II, inherited not a thriving kingdom, but a fractured, humiliated nation. The Spanish crown she wore was tarnished, stained by the legacy of a father whose rule had dragged the monarchy into darkness. Ferdinand's reign had transformed Spain from a world power into a broken and scorned country. His obsession with indulgence cost Spain not only its dignity and its colonies, but its place in the world. More than that, it set a grim example of how absolute power, when paired with moral emptiness, can hollow out the soul of a man and ruin an entire nation in the process. Nearly 2 centuries later, Ferdinand VII is not remembered as a king, but as a predator who used the throne to gratify the lowest instincts of human nature. His life is a warning, a brutal reminder that no amount of royal blood can protect a man from the consequences of unchecked vice. The most depraved monarch in Spanish history died as he deserved, alone, diseased, and despised by all who knew him.